guest. Jordan Peterson is with us in the studio, a professor at the University of Toronto, a clinical psychologist, and the author of 12 Rules for Life, an Antidote to Chaos, which is now out in Icelandic, 12 lífreglur, mótefni við glundroða. It's only the third language which it's translated to, but some 40-something languages are to follow, I understand. Icelanders love him. He has sold out 2 nights at Harpa, one last night and another one tonight. Jordan Peterson, thank you so much for coming. We are delighted to have you here on the program.
Feelings mutual.
You are here for a few days. How has it been so far? What do you think of Iceland?
It's been flawless, I would say. It's been extremely well organized. We've seen some very wonderful things. I have my extended family here, as it turns out, because my mother and my aunt came along because, well, they're out for an adventure and they've been extremely well taken care of, and it's a beautiful country and well run, really well run beyond belief, and the audiences have been very enthusiastic and everyone's been extraordinarily hospitable, and and the weather's been great, so that's not a bad combination.
Yeah, you're lucky with the weather. It's not always this great. You teach 2 courses at Toronto University, Maps of Meaning and Personality. All your lectures are available on YouTube, and you can either watch them as a whole or you can see bits and pieces. And this is in part what has made you world famous and gained you tremendous support. And those videos, they seem to be full of all sorts of coaching advices, from raising children to relationship advices, being a good person and facing all sorts of challenges. Can you talk a little bit about these 2 courses? Tell us a little bit about...
The Maps of Meaning course is based on a book I wrote, which was my first book, called Maps of Meaning, which is coming out in audio form on June 12th. It's a very difficult book, I would say. I wrote it not so much to communicate, let's say, with the general public, but to address and attempt to solve a very complex problem. And I was curious about why the world had found itself in a stalemate after World War II with the Soviet bloc and the Western bloc, say, arming themselves ever more insanely in this ideological deadlock. And I was curious about why the belief systems that each side was putting forward seemed so important that it was worth risking the world itself to support them. And so Maps of Meaning is an inquiry into the purpose of belief systems. And more than that...
And it goes down to the individual.
Yes, well, that's the thing, is that what I came to understand, I think, was that the proper way forward, the proper way of conceptualizing the world is one that's individual-centered. Now, and I was curious about that because, of course, the Soviet view was a collectivist view, and you can make a strong case for a collectivist view, and it might be that either view, the individualist view or the collective view, is arbitrary in some sense. But I don't believe that the view that privileges the individual over the state is arbitrary. I think that it's correct, and correct meaning that if you act it out in the world at the individual level or the family level or the societal level, that it produces societies that are functional and healthy and productive and safe and secure and free in the medium to long term. I think that and then I tried to lay out the psychological reasons for the development of the idea of the sovereign individual, and to show that that was grounded in more than arbitrary ideology. And so Maps of Meaning, the course, that's been a very popular course. I taught that at Harvard for 6 years and then at the University of Toronto ever since. And it's generally regarded as a course that changes people's lives.
Yeah, so many of your students say that.
Yes, it's a very common response.
And why do you think that is? How does it change the students?
Well, we have we have a lot of explicit thoughts that we can articulate, but they're grounded in other forms of thinking. They're grounded in images and artistic expression and narratives. So we're fundamentally grounded in the world inside stories. And maps of meaning is an attempt to lay out the structure of those stories and to say, look, here's how the world is composed. It's composed of chaos and order, which is a strange way of looking at it. And on top of that, there's an ethical struggle which has been formulated most typically as a battle between good and evil. And I think that that's the right way of looking at the world, is that human beings are engaged in the struggle between good and evil on a background of chaos and order. And maps of meaning is an attempt to explain what those categories mean in terms that you can grip and that you can use conceptually and practically in the world. So it's not merely a high-level abstract discussion, although it is that in part. It's an attempt to take that high-level abstract discussion and say, here's why, if you know that, you will be able to operate more effectively in the world. And I think that once you know these categories, you can operate more effectively in the world. It strengthens your resilience in the face of catastrophe, for example. It's encouraging. It helps reestablish the dignity of the individual and to describe why that's a real thing, and the most real thing even. And so it's very salutary for people, because everyone doubts the utility. People doubt their own value. That's probably the most precise way of putting it. And there are reasons that you shouldn't doubt your value. They're deep reasons, and so maps of meaning lays that out.
There was one thing that grabbed me. You were talking about what sort of person you want to be when you're in the face of maybe a death in the family. Can you elaborate a little bit on that?
Things, well, you know, people. It's not easy for people to determine what their goals should be in our culture, because our culture is, I would say, materialistic. And there's some positive things about that, but somewhat shallow in its ethical orientation. And so we think, well, people should strive to be happy. And I think that that's a weak aim. Not that there's anything wrong with being happy. If it happens, great, but it's a side effect of something else.
I see.
It's not a goal in and of itself. A better goal is to be courageous and resilient and strong. And one of the...
But that's a taboo today, some would say.
It's because people don't understand it well. Like, I've told my students that they should try to be the strongest person at their father's funeral. Because you're going to face tremendous adversity in your life, and you need to think through what sort of person you want to be under conditions of adversity. And a funeral is a very good example of that, because it's a catastrophe for everyone involved, and someone has to bear the responsibility to navigate the ship of the family through the storms of the death. And if you think about a person that can do that, obviously such a person is admirable, and there's every reason to set your goal as the development of an admirable character. Something else we don't talk about anymore. It's as if the whole idea of admirable character has been dispensed with.
Yes.
And I think that's associated with the idea, at least in part, of the tyrannical patriarchy. You know, if our culture is nothing but a tyrannical patriarchy, which it is most decidedly not, then anyone who takes forthright action in that structure is nothing but a patriarchal tyrant. It's like none of that is reasonable.
So this is a really negative narrative, this whole patriarchy idea.
It's a terrible narrative. And I think the purpose of the narrative is fundamentally to blur the distinction between competence and power, but to take down competence. That's fundamentally, like, the underground motivation is to blur the line between competence and power, and then to make anyone who manifests any competence feel as if they're doing nothing but manifesting tyranny. And it's a terrible doctrine. And I've seen it really destroy people. I've seen it destroy people. So,
in what context?
Well, if you're punished every time you do anything forthright and courageous and noble by as a consequence of accusations of tyranny and oppression, then everything you do that's good is punished. And as Nietzsche pointed out, if you really want to punish someone, you punish them for their virtues, not for their faults. If you really want to hurt someone, if I punish you because you've done something wrong and you know you've done something wrong, you might not be happy about the punishment. Well, but at least it sets the scales right. I mean, that's Dostoevsky's theme in his great novel Crime and Punishment, you know, where the murderer actually cries out to the heavens to be punished because it's the only way that he can reestablish his humanity. But if you really want to hurt people, then you punish them for their virtues. And we're definitely in a situation, and I think the universities have played a major role in this, where forthright action on the part of ambitious and productive individuals is confused with tyrannical oppression. And a lot of that's a consequence of the disturbed relationships between, well, many of the people who take that tack in the social activist domains in universities have never had a healthy relationship with someone who's masculine. And so they feel that masculinity in itself is toxic, which is...
That's what I was going to ask you next, because the first video that really hooked me, it spoke to me personally, both as a new father at the time and perhaps also as a son of a deceased father. It was where you're talking about the relationship one has with his father. Can you please elaborate a little bit on that?
Well, the proper role of a father, and a mother as well, although the roles aren't identical, I would say the proper fundamental maternal role is one of protection. And the reason for that is quite obvious, is that newborn infants need above all to be protected. The proper response to an infant's distress is, you're right and I'll take care of you right now, especially for the first 9 months of life. There's no disputing that. Whenever the infant is upset, he or she needs to be dealt with as if that upset is justified. Yeah. But then as the infant matures, and even by the age of 9 months, I would say, then that has to be, that interaction has to be made more sophisticated, because the child has to be encouraged to take his or her place in the world. And I would say that encouragement is more on the masculine side of the duty distribution. And a father's fundamental role is to produce a bounded environment in which exploration can take place, with an eye towards the encouragement of the child to develop more and more competence, to push that development. Because, and it's true for mothers and fathers, that the end goal is to produce a person who's capable of operating autonomously in the world. The father's role is to foster that sense of confident autonomy by encouraging the child to push his or her limits. And like that role can be played by mother or father. If it's a masculine role, it doesn't have to be played by a man, but it still tilts in that direction. And so, for example, fathers are much more likely to engage in rough and tumble play with their kids, which is very, very good for them, by the way, and absolutely necessary, and something to be completely encouraged.
Rough and tumble play, yes. That is just fooling around, wrestling
with them. Yeah, wrestling, physical play, because the kids learn, well, they learn all sorts of things. It's like they learn to dance. That's the best way of thinking about it, because a confident child understands the physics of play. And you can see this even in such simple things as going into a park where there's a lot of dogs. And the dogs that are well socialized are very good at acting out playfulness. And you can tell the difference between a growling dog and a mean dog, and a frightened dog and a playful dog. People are very good at making that distinction. And a playful dog knows how to move in a playful manner, and so does a playful child. And that attentive readiness to play is something that's fostered by those play-fight interactions with fathers, for example. And that makes the kid ready in a deep sense to engage with other children. And it also sets the stage for a confident physicality in adolescence and in sexual relationships. I mean, really? and so, yeah, because a lot of our wisdom is embodied. When you wrestle with kids, then they learn what hurts them and what doesn't. They learn how far they can be extended and stretched. They test the limits. They test the limits. They learn to trust, because you throw kids up in the air and you catch them and you push them to the point where they're really excited. So they're right on the edge of fear, actually. The excitement pushes right to the edge of fear. But they learn, and then they also learn how they can interact with someone else physically, and what's acceptable and where the limits of pain are, and what's frightening and what can be sustained, and how to take turns and all of that. And it's not abstract, it's concrete, it's right in the body. And so So that's part of the father's role, but the fundamental paternal role is that of encouragement, and the encouragement is, you can handle it, kid. Life is hard. It's going to come at you in all sorts of ways. You can accept that as a challenge. You can thrive. You can master it. And I'm behind you. Like, I'm behind the best in you manifesting itself in the world. And that gives a kid a spine, metaphysically and physically. And so it's an unbelievably important thing to do. And fatherlessness is a catastrophe.
Yeah.
Like, if you look at the epidemiological literature, the psychological literature, fatherlessness predicts all sorts of terrible outcomes. It's not good. And we've fallen into this idea in our society that fathers aren't necessary. It's like, and it's just a family that's run by a single mother is just as good in the broad sense as a family with two parents. And it's simply not true. All the evidence suggests, now that doesn't mean that there aren't single parents who are nobly raising their children, because there are. But in the aggregate, the two-parent family is a much better arrangement for children.
You said that without the encouragement of the father, it's as if its spirit will be left outside the walls of civilization.
Yes, well, that's exactly it. Is that the father's role is to note that the individual is capable of thriving in a difficult world, and to put that message forward, and to note that that's been the message of people who've been successful throughout history, and that each individual is capable of doing that, at least to some degree, and has no better bet. Has no better alternative. So
you have been called YouTube's new father figure. Your advices, they are kind of fatherly. Is that something that comes with the territory of being a psychologist, or is this your own personal touch?
I would say both. Well, it's both being a professor, at least in principle, and being a psychologist, a clinical psychologist. So I'm a hybrid of those two things. And I was also trained, like, I've read deeply in the clinical literature, psychoanalytic, existential, humanist. There's all sorts of different streams of clinical thinking, all of which have something very valuable to offer, I would say. But I was trained technically as a behavioral psychologist, and one of the things that a behavioral psychologist is trained to do is to take a large problem and to break it down into units that are small enough to actually manage practically. And so I've always considered my teaching in that light, as my goal is to take high-level abstractions and to break them down until they're practically applicable. And so I suppose, so that's both educational, so that's the professorial side, and psychologically meaningful, so that's the clinical psychology side, because clinical psychologists fortify the individual. That's really their role. And to the degree that that's a fatherly role, well, partly that's a consequence of the fact that I have been a father, I still am, and that I'm of the age where that's an appropriate way of interacting with people. But it's also in the same category in some sense as, like, because the purpose of a father psychologically is to fortify the courage of his children. And so that's appropriate for me given the stage of the development of my career, for example.
You talked about the importance for people to sort out early on where they want to go with their lives. Why is this important?
Yeah, well, we've done some practical work on this too. I have this program called Future Authoring, which is part of the self-authoring suite, and it's available to everyone online. I developed with my colleagues about 15 years ago, and our goal was to produce high-quality psychological interventions for mass audiences at an extremely low cost, and to do it in a way that was least likely to cause negative consequences. So that was the framework. And the Future Authoring program helps people develop a vision for their life. And so you're asked to imagine that you were taking care of yourself properly. So you're taking responsibility for yourself, not taking the easy way out or being nice to yourself or bolstering your self-esteem or any of that, but taking responsibility for your life. And to envision who you could be, if you could be who you should be 3 to 5 years down the road, just to ask yourself, well, if I could have what I wanted and needed, and if I was acting in the world properly, what would my friendships look like? What would my intimate relationship look like? How would I conduct myself with regards to my family. I've had lots of people come to my talks and say, look, I've really been trying to put together my family. We were fragmented badly, and so I've been working for 2 years to bring everyone together, and it's really working. It's like people tell me that all the time, which is a lovely thing to hear. How should you construct your career? How should you educate yourself? You should resist temptation, like the temptation of drugs and alcohol, take care of yourself mentally and physically. Just have an image of, if the world could be set up around you, starting with you, in a way that would be best for you and for other people as well, what would that look like? Well, without that sort of vision, you don't have a target, and you don't have any hope. And like, people live on hope, and your aim gives you hope. And so the nobler your aim, the more hope you have, and you need hope, especially during times of catastrophe. And so it's extremely necessary for people to consider their character development, because that's actually what sustains them through the difficulties of life. And it seems as if we've either never knew this in our education system, or have forgotten it completely. And we can't forget that, because that's actually the purpose of education. The purpose of education is the development of character. It's not mastery over a set of facts, even though there's some utility in that mastery. If the facts are dead, if they're just lying there and they're not given life by being integrated into a noble narrative, let's say, then they're of no utility. They might even be harmful. So, and we've done research. If university students do the future authoring program, it decreases the probability they'll drop out of school by about 30%. And it seems to have a particularly large effect on underachieving men. And we're not sure exactly why that gender differential exists, but it might partly be because in the main, women are outperforming men in academic environments. And so these programs seem to boost the performance of the lower performers. But it also might be that men in particular won't engage in the world properly unless they have their own aims.
Yeah, I was going to ask, why do you think men are underachieving or not living up to their full potential?
I think part of it is the contamination of competence with tyranny. Is that if every time you turn around, when you're attempting to win a competition, for example, or take your place in the world, the implicit or explicit accusation is that you're exercising tyranny and participating in an oppressive patriarchy, and there's something wrong with you ethically for doing so. It's an invitation to the weak part of your character to take over. It's like, well, why should I try to do anything when everything I do is criticized, and when I'm regarded? And it's not only that, because like, I've met many men who've really believed that their ambitions to take their place in the world are part of the oppressive patriarchal structure that's responsible for the dispossession of the dispossessed and the destruction of the ecological landscape, and that their best bet was just to do nothing, just to sit there and do nothing, because at least then they'd be harmless, as if harmlessness is the highest possible goal. But if everything is oppressive power and that's wrong, then powerlessness is the most impressive goal. But there's no life in that. So I'm going to sit here and be harmless. It's like
has become a mainstream view. I feel like. What do you think? Is it taken over completely?
There's certainly no shortage of pressure to make it become the mainstream view. Well, this is where I think too the universities play a terrible role, because the universities have facilitated the development of these activist disciplines, women's studies probably foremost among them, but social work, anthropology, often English literature has become completely corrupt, law is heading in that direction, and you have 1/5 of social scientists identifying themselves as Marxists, which I think is beyond reprehensible given the history of Marxism. And this patriarchal what would you say, this conceptual scheme that insists that Western cultures are fundamentally oppressive patriarchies has become not only like holy writ in the universities, but is spilling out into the mainstream with incredible rapidity. And it's an absolutely horrible doctrine.
Political correctness, it seems to be taking up more and more space now, and you've been quite vocal against it, but it feels like a lot of people don't really understand what it is. It is often mixed up with common courtesy, for an example. Can you define political correctness for us? Why is it not good?
Well, political correctness, I would say, is fundamentally a collectivist doctrine. And collectivist doctrines insist that the proper way of parsing up the world is through the lens of group identity. So you could think about it as part of the expression of identity politics, which is something that's gripped the left, probably something that cost Hillary Clinton the election in the United States in the last election cycle. And the people who are politically correct insist that individuals are basically avatars of their group, and that the world is a battleground of groups vying for dominance in a power competition.
It doesn't matter who you are as an individual, it's only what group you belong to.
Yes. Well, I would say within the confines of the politically correct doctrine, there aren't individuals. There are only groups vying for power. That's why the politically correct types oppose free speech. It isn't that they oppose it. It's worse than that. It's that from within the confines of the politically correct doctrine, there's no such thing as free speech, because what you claim as your free speech is actually nothing but your justification of the hierarchy that gives your group dominance. That's everything from the politically correct perspective. And so there's no real possibility even for dialogue between well-meaning individuals, because there's no such thing as dialogue to begin with, and there's no such thing as well-meaning individuals. And so it's almost impossible to overstate how pernicious that doctrine is. It demolishes the idea of individual sovereignty and the possibility of communication across individuals. That's why it produces ideas like cultural appropriation, because there's no, all that happens if you utilize the artifacts of another culture, it isn't that you admire them or that it's part of trade or that it's part of the free expression of ideas. It's that you're taking away the artifacts of power from that other group in an attempt to foster your own group dominance. Yeah. Everything's viewed through that lens.
This is if I would dress up as an Indian for a costume party.
Yeah. Well, that's that sort of thing has caused all sorts of trouble in American universities, where because they've produced warnings about Halloween costumes. I mean, it's absurd in many ways, as if dressing up in Mexican national uniform, let's say national clothing, or Dutch national clothing for that matter, is some kind of insult. It isn't an insult, and even if it was, that's Halloween is a time to break rules. That's the whole point of the celebration. So
political correctness has corrupted the universities or large fields.
As far as I'm concerned, it has, and the universities are doing everything they can to corrupt other institutions, and the other institutions are foolishly going along for the ride. So you see, for example, and this is probably more true in the US than anywhere else, although also in Canada, Australia as well, that corporations are under the pressure of this politically correct fostering of guilt, are admitting, despite the fact that there's no scientific validity for this claim whatsoever, that their employees are en masse structurally racist, and that people are viewing the world through the lens of implicit bias, and that we're all fundamentally racist, and that should be rectified through like re-education. So unconscious bias retraining programs, for which there is no evidence whatsoever that those programs work, and a substantial amount of evidence that they're counterproductive. And the implicit association test that has been put forward hypothetically to diagnose racism, implicit racism, is not a valid or reliable test and cannot be used for those purposes. And even the makers of the test, Brian Nosek and Anthony Greenwald, have admitted publicly that their test is being misused. All of that's extraordinarily dangerous. And if corporate executives had any sense, they would stop rushing to admit that their corporations are structurally racist. It's a very bad idea.
And this is all under the influence, you say, of postmodernism and neo-Marxism.
Yeah,
but aren't those things two separate things?
They're completely separate. And this is something I've been criticized for. Dr. Peterson doesn't understand the difference between neo-Marxism and postmodernism. It's like, I understand the difference perfectly well. It isn't me that's conflating them. it turns out that the people who push postmodern doctrines in the university almost always ally themselves with a Marxist viewpoint. And that is logically incoherent. But I would say the postmodernists really don't give a damn for logical coherence, because they regard that as part of the oppressive, patriarchal, Eurocentric view of the world. The idea that there's an objective reality and all of that, and that you can deal with it with logic. I think that there is an alliance between the postmodern types and the neo-Marxists. And as far as I can tell, when I looked at the development of postmodern ideas, which really came to prominence in France, it was all failed Marxists who pushed the doctrine forward. And I think it's a wolf in sheep's clothing. Identity politics is just Marxism under a different guise. So instead of the narrative being the privileged economic class, the bourgeoisie against the proletariat, that didn't sell so well and produced tens of millions of deaths, that fundamental narrative. There was a sleight of hand that said, well, it's not economic class, it's race, or it's gender, or it's ethnicity, or it's sex. But it doesn't matter, because the fundamental narrative is still victimizer versus victim. And so it's Marxism under another guise. And the fact that postmodernists technically are skeptical of meta-narratives, like large-scale explanatory structures, should mean that they're equally skeptical about Marxist claims, because that's a grand narrative. But in practically speaking, that isn't how it works out. And so this alliance does exist, even though conceptually it's completely incoherent. So I really don't believe that that postmodernism is something in and of itself. I think it's a camouflage for Marxism under another name.
I see. So, and these ideas of yours, they are the ones that gain you the largest groups of enemies, and you get most criticized for. Well, the
thing is, the radical leftist types, and I would say they're the leftist collectivists, and I'm, by the way, no fan of right-wing collectivists either. It's just that they don't threaten the universities. There's no right-wing collectivists in the universities, like none. There's no right-wingers. There's no conservatives. There are hardly any liberals in most of the activist disciplines. The radical left types don't like me at all, and that's okay, because the feeling is mutual. I think that
but they can orchestrate vicious attacks and hit pieces in the biggest medias.
Well, I've had the full gamut of treatment in the media, I would say, and in Canada, for example, there's a handful of outstanding journalists who act as individuals, a dozen of them, let's say, maybe slightly less than that. And they've been firmly supporting me the whole time. And the Post Media Group in Canada, which was a consortium of 200 newspapers, came out in favor of my free speech stance in relationship to Bill C-16. And so I've been treated very well by some elements of the media. But it's definitely the case that I've also been pilloried and caricatured and stereotyped as an alt-right figure, I suppose, sometimes as a far-right figure for that matter, by venues that should have known better. NBC did a terrible video hit piece on me. It was an appalling piece of careless, provocative journalism. It was
they were exposed.
They were exposed very well. It was. I couldn't believe it when I watched it. I thought, not only are you people crooked, but you're stupid and incompetent. You should get one of those things right. You shouldn't be all three of those things at the same time. They interviewed me for 90 minutes, and it was a contentious interview conducted by a narcissistic interviewer. And then they chopped it into like a 3-minute teaser that was just outright falsehoods. And then people on YouTube took the actual interview and the edited version and juxtaposed them, showing that they'd actually reversed the meaning of some of the things I said.
I saw it.
But so far, the attacks have been, I would say, highly counterproductive. And I've been in this very strange situation, which I feel that it's a tenuous situation, that every time there's been a protest, say, against my appearance on a university campus, which has happened many times, or an attack piece, then it's very stressful, and the potential for damaging my reputation appears high, but the medium to long-term consequence of that is that the journalists end up more discredited than me.
So this is probably because, you have one of your life rules is tell the truth, or at least don't tell a lie. That's probably what works with you.
Well, maybe. I hope that's what works. I mean, I think one of the things that protected me right from the beginning was when I came out against the compelled speech legislation in Canada. I already had about 250 hours of lectures online. And so when I was accused of being all sorts of terrible things, people went and looked me up, and then my lectures were there. Like virtually, in some sense, every word that I've said to students in a public forum, like a class, for the last 30 years has been videotaped. Now, not every class, but like enough of the classes so that it's a perfectly representative sample of what I've actually teaching. And so people go and look up this reprehensible professor, and then they start listening to what I'm actually saying, and they think, oh, well, he's not the person that the media is making him out to be at all. It's like, actually, it's the opposite. It's not only that it's not true, it's that it's the opposite of truth. So, and that's protected me. And that's good if your own words can protect you. And, you know, I've also had my enemies, let's say, or those who consider themselves my enemies, have gone over my lectures with a fine-tooth comb. And they've found a couple of things that might be regarded as contentious, and have tried to blow those up into a scandal. And that's failed utterly on the 2 or 3 occasions that it's occurred, because there aren't smoking pistols in my lectures. So
what do you think, I mean, about all this political correctness and postmodernism, Marxists and all that? It feels like there's a lot of steering in Western society now.
A lot of
steering up. Something is frying underneath. And
yes, definitely.
Are we on a brink of a cultural war, or are we in the middle of one? Or
we're definitely in the middle of a war of ideas. There's absolutely no doubt about that. And it's not a political war. It's not even a philosophical war. It's actually, I think, it's closer to a theological war. And what's being questioned is the primacy of the individual. It's being deeply attacked, and that attack is really being led by the universities, and the attackers are subsidized by the state and by ever accelerating tuition fees, and how that will play itself out is difficult to say. I mean, the danger is that we'll produce a plethora of radicals on the left and a plethora of radicals on the right, both playing a collectivist game, because the radical right-wingers play the same game, except the radical left-wingers use guilt to bring down the dominant power hierarchy, let's say, guilt and accusations of oppression. But the right-wingers basically say, look, we'll play the same collectivist game, but don't be thinking we're going to play to lose. Yeah, if we're going to be our race, or we're going to be our gender, then we're going to play to win. That's exactly right. And I think that both of those ways of conceptualizing the world are deeply flawed. And the danger is that will fragment into those polarized groups, and that'll produce the same long-term consequences that played themselves out in the 20th century. I don't think that will happen. I think that people will come to their senses. I think the universities have made so many mistakes that their overall survival in unchanged form is highly unlikely over the next 10 years. I think
the overall survival of the universities?
Yes. Well, there's already, what would you call, prognostications that up to 30% of American universities and colleges will fail financially in the next 10 years. And partly because they're making so many mistakes. Tuition fees have gone completely off the rails. They're way above, their rate of increase is way above the inflation rate. They're administratively top-heavy. The ethics committees are strangling research. They're gerrymandering their accreditation processes. Students in the United States take out student loans and essentially mortgage their futures, and then they can't declare bankruptcy, so they're basically led into indentured servitude. The incremental economic utility of a university degree is declining, especially if you control for IQ, because, you know, smarter people tend to go to university, so they make more money. So was it because they went to university or because they're smarter? And most of the evidence suggests it's because they're smarter, not because they went to university. So the incremental economic utility of a university degree is starting to become questionable.
I see.
And that's a lot of mistakes.
You can learn everything on YouTube now.
Well, there's that too, is that there's other mechanisms of education that are going to be far cheaper, that are going to be tremendously competitive in the next 10 years. And so I think the universities are going to do themselves in.
But you talk of activist studies, women's studies, gender studies, and I mean, the feminists and the gender study types, they I think sincerely believe that they are making the world better with their campaigns and their struggles.
You don't make the world better by pushing collectivist doctrines. You don't make the world better by assigning guilt to people on the basis of their group.
But do you believe that
white
they
privilege
believe
is a good example?
No, they're on the right way?
No, I don't believe that. I don't believe, because one of the things I've been doing, I was asked to write the preface for Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago for the 50th anniversary edition, which was a great honor. And so I've been writing that preface. And one of the things I've been trying to figure out is, why the hell did good intentions go so wrong in the Soviet Union? And the answer to that is complex, but part of it is, well, don't be thinking that all the intentions were good. You know, it's like when you stand up for the poor, it's always possible that you're standing up against the successful. It's like, well, what makes you think your motivations are so pure? You think you're just motivated by love and compassion, eh? It's like, where's all the hatred and the aggression? Well, I don't have any of that. It's like, oh, yes, you do. And if you think that love, in your case, is a more powerful force than hate, you might want to think again. And if you look at what happened, the Russian Revolution became bloody and murderous instantly. And what happened was, you know, it was predicated on the idea of the class warfare, which is no different than the victim-victimizer narrative that's being put forward today. Well, the idea of who the oppressor was just grew without boundary. And so they rounded up the students, they rounded up the religious people, they rounded up the socialists and killed all of them, by the way. Because the truth of the matter is that every person is an oppressor and is oppressed at the same time. And so if you take any given person, you can come up with a reason why they're part of the victimizer class. Maybe they're attractive, maybe they're educated, maybe they're intelligent, maybe their parents were reasonably well off, maybe they're white, maybe they're male. Like, you can find some manner in which they're participating in oppression. And as soon as you do that, you can identify them as criminal.
And you see a parallel with the Soviet Union revolution and what's happening today.
Well, I see a parallel between the doctrines that drove the Soviet Union into the ground and the doctrines that the activist disciplines are promoting. They're the same doctrines. It's not. And I certainly see that. And Jonathan Haidt has done a very good job with his Heterodox Academy at documenting the fact that there's no mainstream liberal or conservative voices especially in the activist disciplines, but really in the social sciences and humanities as a whole. And this victimizer narrative and the identity politics frame of reference is the dominant frame of reference. And so, yes, I see them as, they seem to be the same thing. Well, they're certainly left-wing perspectives. They're radical left-wing perspectives. It's like, well, how is that different than these original radical, except it's not, it's still economic class to some degree, but that's been subsumed by the identity politics overlay, but it's the same basic narrative. So,
and I mean, this has been building up in the university since you talk about the French intellectuals in the 60s or 70s. And why hasn't anyone pointed this out sooner?
Oh, they have. I mean, oh, sure. I mean, there was a real rise in political correctness in the early 90s. But I think what happened was, because I was in the United States when that was happening, and I think what happened was the internet revolution took off and the American economy just boomed. And because the economy was booming, because there were so many opportunities, the whole political controversy just sort of
pulled the teeth out of it.
Yeah, it just calmed down, and everybody thought, well, that it was put back where it should be. But over the last 5 years, it's like, and it's hard to tell exactly why. I think maybe it hit a tipping point again. There's been enough radical activists produced and supported by the universities so that things are tipping hard in that direction. You see that playing itself out in human resources departments in corporations, because it's the human resources departments that tend to be the places where the social justice activists aggregate inside corporations, and they're, pushing their diversity, inclusivity, and equity doctrines very hard within corporations. And, the activist disciplines, they train people to go out and infiltrate, is the proper word, all sorts of organizations and bring them into the politically correct domain of operation with the politically correct conceptualizations. They don't make any secret of that.
No, so they state it on their websites.
They state it on their websites, yeah. It's not like I'm inventing activist disciplines. They state very forthrightly that their role is to serve as a counter to the oppressive patriarchy. It's like, okay, really, that's what our societies are they? They're oppressive patriarchies. Really? Compared to what? Countries in the rest of the world? Or countries and states by historical standards? They're actually the freest, most productive societies that have ever existed anywhere, and they're getting better very rapidly. And if that's your definition of oppressive patriarchy, then well, then you're either motivated by motivations you don't want to admit to, or you're so historically ignorant that it's a kind of crime.
What do you think about, Iceland recently became the world's first nation to make it mandatory for companies and institutions with more than 25 employees to prove that they pay men and women equally for the same job?
Well, the first thing I would say is that violates the presumption of innocence. You're not supposed to prove your innocence. And it's a very bad precedent to lay down. And we are losing the presumption of innocence. Like the whole idea of group guilt is the demolition of the presumption of individual innocence. They're the same thing.
We've had the equal pay law since 1976, but now they're supposed to prove it.
Right. Well, the other thing that's happening is that, first of all, there are many reasons for the gender pay gap. And perhaps some of those reasons should be addressed. So the most fundamental reason for the gender pay gap isn't gender. It's motherhood. And that's not the same thing. So it's clearly the case that women take a hit in their salaries once they decide to be mothers. Now, it's conceivable that that's something that society should address, although we don't know how to address it. So, but, you could say, well, that's...
But we have paternity leave, but it still doesn't flatten it out.
No, it's because these things are far more complex than the ideologues insist, because they say, well, there's a gender pay gap. And the reason for the gender pay gap is that men are oppressing women. It's like, well, no. A reason for the gender pay gap might be that there's some residual prejudice. But there are many other factors at play. So here's a couple of them. Men work longer hours than women on average. Okay, so if you work 14% longer hours, that produces a 40% increment in pay. It's nonlinear. Men work in dangerous jobs. Men are more likely to move. Well, that's three. There's more reasons than that men make more money than women. But those are three reasons. Men are less agreeable, and agreeable people make less money too because they're not as effective at negotiating on their own behalf. Men tend to aggregate in enterprises, in occupations that scale. So, for example, if you're interested in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, the STEM fields. You're also in domains where you can scale your operations. If you're involved in the care of individuals, which is something that women's interests tilt them towards, it's much more difficult to scale those enterprises. So it's harder to generate large pools of capital around them. And you might say, well, the only reason that there aren't more women in the STEM disciplines is because of patriarchal oppression. But the data indicate very clearly that as you make your societies more egalitarian, fewer women choose STEM fields, not more. So, because there's also this idea that the only reason that men and women choose different occupations is because of social pressure. But the data, the psychological data, show that that's actually a false claim, because as you make your societies more egalitarian, men and women become more different rather than more the same. And so the social constructionists, the politically correct types, they have no idea what to do with that data, so they just call it, well, it's pseudoscience. It's like, no, actually, it's mainstream psychological research conducted by people who are overwhelmingly left-leaning.
You mean the personality science?
The personality.
The 5 personality traits.
That's right. That's part of that, and the differences in interest, but it's also epidemiological studies of occupational choice.
And it's not disputed that men are less agreeable.
No, it's not. Well, it's not only is it not disputed, It's self-evident. So here's an example. There are about 10 times as many men incarcerated as women, and they tend to be incarcerated for one variant of violence or another. The best predictor of incarceration, the best personality predictor, although it's a weak predictor, is low agreeableness. Okay, so now, on average, men and women aren't that much different in aggression. So, for example, if you take a random woman and a random man out of the population, quite a lot. It's not a huge deviation from 50-50. But if you go out to the extremes and you say, okay, well, fair enough, but if you take the most aggressive person out of 50 and you had to bet on whether they were male or female, you'd always bet male, and you'd be right like 90% of the time. And the only people you incarcerate are the most aggressive people, and they're all men. Well, and you look at something like engineering, men and women's interests differ in aggregate. Women are more interested in people and men are more interested in things, comparatively speaking. At the mid-range, that doesn't matter that much, but if you pick the 1 in 50 people who are most interested in things, they're almost all men. Well, they become engineers. It's not like everyone's an engineer. Hardly anyone's an engineer. And most engineers are male, and they're the males who are most interested in things. And that's partly why you have all these jokes about engineers. It's like, well, they're socially awkward. It's like, well, yeah, their domain isn't people. Their domain is things. So
these differences that you're talking about, the gender differences, they seem to be a huge taboo.
Yeah, well,
people don't want to hear it.
No, it's a very strange thing, because you might say, well, let's say that you're in favor of the emancipation of the sexes. It's like, well, you should want to hear it. It's like, leave people be so they can make their free choices. Now, it turns out that they're going to make choices that are gendered to some degree, and perhaps that's as it should be. But the idea that you have to impose homogeneity on everyone in the name of freeing them from oppression is an absolutely absurd proposition. It's like...
Last question, Jordan Peterson. Everything went sideways here in Iceland recently when you were quoted in the New York Times saying that enforced monogamy was the cure for the anger of the Toronto incel killer. Can you explain what you meant exactly by enforced monogamy?
Well, the first thing is you know, the woman who wrote that article was with me for like 2 days, and that particular conversation occupied a tiny percentage of our conversation, perhaps 3 minutes, and she certainly jumped on it. All I meant was that the anthropological literature has been clear on this for 100 years. Crystal clear. There's no one who's disputing this. Monogamy stabilizes societies. It decreases, for example, it decreases male aggression. So men tend to stabilize in their around mid-20s, and they stop drinking as much, they stop engaging in impulsive drug use, and they're less likely to be aggressive. And a huge part of the reason for that is that they take on the responsibility of a permanent relationship and start thinking about moving towards having a family. And it's the case that polygamous societies are very violent, and part of the reason for that is that access to reproductive opportunity is not reasonably distributed, and societies stabilize themselves by adopting monogamous social norms. That's the enforcement. Look, here's the enforcement. I'll give you just a quick example. Let's say your son has been married for a year, and he comes over and he says, "Dad, I've had 6 affairs since I've been married." What are you going to do? You pat him on the back and say, "Way to be, son"? You don't. You say, "What the hell's wrong with you? You made a monogamous commitment." Well, that's the enforcement. The enforcement is the social norms. And she knew perfectly well that I was talking about social norms and not like armed enforcement as an element of the state.
But if we already have those social norms, how can that be a cure for that?
Well, I would say they're wavering the social norms.
They're wavering.
You know, the idea that monogamous relationships, permanent monogamous relationships, are the proper mode of operation is something that's been increasingly questionable since the sexual revolution in the 1960s. And there's reasons for that. I mean, once we developed reliable birth control, the question about what the rules for sexual conduct should be, it became a different question, right? So like, well, now we have reliable birth control. What does that mean for sexual relations? Well, the first answer was everybody gets to sleep with everyone all the time. It's like, well, that turned out, among other things, well, it turned out to produce problems that no one intended because nobody knew what the consequences of that would be. And so, and it's produced destabilization of marriages, for example. And a huge increase in the number of women who had single-parent families and tend to descend in poverty as a consequence, for example. It's destabilized marriage. So mostly the people who get married now are well off. People who are married stably tend to be rich, which begs the question, why would the rich subject themselves to an oppressive patriarchal institution? But it's destabilized the social structure for the dispossessed, and that's not been good. The monogamous norms are appropriate. They're good for men, they're good for women, and above all, they're good for children. And so and that's why all over the world, it's a human universal to enforce monogamous social conventions. Now, that doesn't mean there aren't polygamous societies, but they're rare and they tend to be hyper-violent. So that's all I meant by that.
Very good. It's been an honor having you here on the show, Jordan Peterson. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the invitation.
And enjoy your stay in Iceland.
I am definitely doing that.